The Grand Deception. Victoria Hayes stood before the full-length mirror in the bridal suite of the Belmont Hotel, watching her reflection with calm detachment. The ivory wedding gown hugged her figure perfectly, its delicate lace sleeves ending just above her wrists. Her mother had sewn similar patterns on clothing for wealthy clients for 20 years, but never imagined her daughter would wear such elegance. The irony made Victoria's lips curve into the faintest smile. Margaret Hayes dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, her weathered hands trembling slightly. She had worked her fingers raw creating beautiful things for others, never keeping anything for herself. Thomas stood near the window, his broad shoulders filling out the simple suit he had purchased from a department store. He looked uncomfortable, like a man attending a funeral rather than his daughter's wedding. The arrangement had come suddenly, like a storm nobody predicted. Christopher Mercer, patriarch of the Mercer business empire, had approached the Hayes family with a proposition that seemed absurd. His son Julian needed a wife to secure a crucial international business deal. The investors wanted proof of stability, maturity, responsibility. Julian's reputation as a playboy threatened everything Christopher had built. The solution was simple in Christopher's mind. Find a respectable young woman from a modest background, arrange a marriage, and present the perfect image of reformed character. Victoria fit the profile exactly. She was 24, worked as an assistant at a small publishing house, lived simply, and had no social media presence to complicate matters. She was invisible to the world that mattered to the Mercers, which made her perfect. What Christopher never questioned was why Victoria agreed so readily. No negotiation, no demands, just a quiet acceptance that seemed almost too convenient. He attributed it to desperation, assuming her family needed money. He was wrong about many things, but that particular miscalculation would cost him everything. The ceremony of contempt. The cathedral was magnificent, with soaring ceilings and stained glass windows that cast colored light across marble floors. 600 guests filled the pews, most of them business associates, society figures, and journalists carefully selected to witness this transformation. Julian Mercer stood at the altar in a custom Italian suit, his dark hair perfectly styled, his expression one of barely concealed irritation. Victoria walked down the aisle alone. She had insisted on it, declining her father's traditional role. Thomas had been relieved, uncertain how he would manage that long walk under so many judgmental stares. Her steps were measured, confident, her head held high. She carried a simple bouquet of white roses, their thorns carefully removed. She studied Julian as she approached. He was handsome in the way expensive things often are, polished and precise but lacking warmth. His jaw was tight, his blue eyes cold as winter ice. He looked at her the way someone might examine an unwanted gift, searching for a return receipt. The officiant began with traditional words, his voice echoing through the vast space. Victoria barely heard him. She was aware of the whispers, the camera phones being discreetly raised, the buzz of anticipation that filled the air like electricity before a lightning strike. When the moment came, the officiant posed the question that would bind them. Julian Christopher Mercer, do you take Victoria and Hayes to be your lawfully wedded wife? Julian turned to face the congregation. His smile was sharp as broken glass. No. The single word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through the entire assembly. Gasps echoed from every corner. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Thomas half rose from his seat before sinking back down, his face drained of color. Julian's voice carried clearly, designed for maximum impact. I want everyone here to witness this moment. To understand what desperation looks like when it wears a wedding dress. Victoria remained perfectly still, her face composed, her hands steady on the bouquet. This woman, Julian continued, gesturing toward Victoria as if presenting evidence, agreed to this arrangement because she saw an opportunity. A chance to climb the social ladder on my family's reputation. My father orchestrated this circus because he thinks I need fixing, that marrying some ordinary girl will somehow make me respectable. Christopher stood abruptly. Julian, stop this immediately. Why, father? Isn't honesty what you're always preaching? Let me be honest then. He turned back to Victoria, his expression twisted with contempt. You're a lovely person, I'm sure. Probably very kind to animals and children. But this marriage is a transaction I refuse to complete. I won't be bought, controlled, or manipulated into marrying someone so far beneath my station that it's almost comical. The cruelty in his voice was calculated, precise. Each word chosen to inflict maximum damage. He wanted to humiliate not just Victoria, but his father, to demonstrate that Christopher's control had limits. I have a real life waiting for me, Julian said, straightening his tie. Real relationships with people who actually belong in my world. Not some charity case my father picked up to teach me a lesson about humility. He walked past Victoria without another glance, his footsteps echoing in the horrified silence. The massive doors slammed behind him with a sound like a judge's gavel. The aftermath of shame. The cathedral erupted into chaos. Voices rose in shock and speculation. Cameras flashed as journalists scrambled to capture every moment of this spectacular disaster. Society matrons clutched their pearls and whispered furiously to their neighbors. Christopher Mercer stood frozen, his carefully planned solution dissolving before his eyes. Victoria remained at the altar, still holding her bouquet. Her face showed no emotion, no tears, no anger. She simply stood there, a statue in white lace, while the world collapsed around her. Olivia Chen pushed through the crowd, her face fierce with protective rage. She reached Victoria and grasped her arm. Come on. We're leaving. Now. But Victoria didn't move immediately. Instead, she looked directly at Christopher Mercer, who had collapsed back into his pew, his head in his hands. Their eyes met across the chaos, and something passed between them. A understanding, perhaps. Or a warning. It's all right, Victoria said quietly to Olivia. Her voice was steady, almost serene. Everything is exactly as it should be. Margaret and Thomas surrounded their daughter, forming a protective barrier against the staring crowd. They guided her down the aisle, past faces filled with pity, curiosity, and schadenfreude. Flash photography created strobe effects, turning their exit into a surreal nightmare. Outside, the spring afternoon was beautiful, indifferent to human drama. Birds sang in the trees lining the cathedral steps. Sunlight warmed the stone walkway. The world continued turning as if nothing significant had happened. Victoria paused at the bottom of the steps and looked back at the cathedral. A small smile touched her lips, there and gone so quickly that Olivia later wondered if she had imagined it. Take me home, Victoria said. I have phone calls to make. As they drove away, leaving the chaos behind, Victoria pulled a phone from her clutch purse. Not her regular phone, but a different one. Sleek, expensive, with a European number displayed on the screen. She typed a single message in French, Phase 1 complete. Proceed as planned. She deleted the message immediately after sending it, then powered down the phone. Through the car window, she watched the city pass by, her expression thoughtful and completely calm. Behind them, Julian Mercer celebrated his freedom at an exclusive bar, surrounded by friends who praised his courage. Christopher Mercer sat alone in his study, staring at contracts that would never be signed, deals that would never close, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. Neither of them knew that the Real story was just beginning. Neither of them suspected that the humble, humiliated bride had just set in motion events that would destroy everything they had built. Neither of them realized that Victoria Hayes was not who she appeared to be, and that the truth she carried would shake their entire world to its foundation. The game had started. And Victoria held all the cards. The crumbling empire. 6 months passed like sand through broken fingers. Julian Mercer sat in his corner office on the 42nd floor, watching his empire dissolve in slow motion. The view of the city skyline that once represented his dominance now felt like a mockery, a reminder of heights from which he was steadily falling. The international deal his father had tried to secure collapsed within weeks of the wedding disaster. The European investors withdrew completely, citing concerns about character and stability. Other partnerships followed like dominoes, each one taking a piece of the Mercer fortune with it. Competitors who had once feared the Mercer name now circled like sharks sensing blood in the water. Robert Sterling sat across from Julian, spreading financial reports across the glass desk. His expression was grave, the look of a doctor delivering terminal news. The numbers told a story of systematic failure, of opportunities lost and bridges burned. "We're hemorrhaging clients," Robert said, his finger tracing a downward trend line. 3 major accounts withdrew last week alone. They're not even offering explanations anymore. Just termination notices and apologies. Julian rubbed his temples, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. He had aged in these 6 months, the arrogance that once defined him replaced by something harder and more brittle. His social circle had evaporated. The friends who celebrated his rebellion at the wedding had scattered when his financial troubles became public knowledge. Loyalty, he discovered, was expensive, and he could no longer afford it. "What about the Patterson account?" Julian asked, grasping at straws. "They've been with us for 15 years. Gone. Signed with Hartford Industries yesterday." Robert paused, his expression troubled. "Julian, there's something else. A pattern I've been noticing in these defections." "What kind of pattern?" "They're all going to the same place. A new consulting firm that appeared about 4 months ago. European-based, but operating here now. They're offering services similar to ours, but somehow they're getting access to information that should be confidential. Client lists, pricing structures, internal strategies. It's like they have someone on the inside." Julian's stomach tightened. Corporate espionage was serious, potentially criminal. But proving it required resources he no longer had. "Do we know who runs this firm?" "That's the strange part. The ownership is buried under layers of shell companies and international holdings. But the name keeps coming up in whispers. Hayes International Consulting." The name struck Julian like a physical blow. Hayes. It couldn't be coincidence. His mind raced back to that day at the cathedral, to Victoria standing perfectly still while he destroyed her in front of hundreds of witnesses. Her face had shown no emotion, no pain. Just that strange, serene calm that he had interpreted as shock. The unexpected encounter. 3 days later, Julian attended a charity gala he could barely afford to be seen at. Appearances mattered, even when your world was crumbling. The ballroom glittered with wealth and influence, the kind of crowd he had once navigated effortlessly. Now he felt like an outsider, aware of the whispers that followed him, the subtle ways people avoided making eye contact. He was standing near the bar, nursing a drink he wasn't tasting, when he saw her. Victoria Hayes stood across the room, but she wasn't the woman he remembered. This Victoria wore a midnight blue gown that probably cost more than most cars, diamonds glittering at her throat and wrists. Her hair was styled in an elegant twist, her makeup subtle but expertly applied. She moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who belonged, stopping to exchange greetings with business leaders and politicians Julian recognized from financial news broadcasts. She was laughing at something a silver-haired gentleman was saying, her hand resting lightly on his arm in a gesture of easy familiarity. The man was Gerard Fontaine, Julian realized with growing shock. CEO of one of the largest investment firms in Europe, a man whose net worth made the Mercer fortune look like pocket change. Julian's heart hammered against his ribs. He pushed through the crowd, driven by confusion and a growing sense of dread. As he approached, Victoria's gaze lifted and met his. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, certainly. But also something else. Satisfaction, perhaps. Or vindication. Julian, she said, her voice warm and polite, as if greeting a distant acquaintance rather than the man who had humiliated her publicly. What a surprise to see you here. Gerard Fontaine studied Julian with the interest one might show a curiosity in a museum. Mercer, yes? I've been reading about your company's difficulties. Unfortunate business, that. Julian ignored him, focusing entirely on Victoria. We need to talk. Do we? Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. I can't imagine what we'd have to discuss. Unless you're looking for business advice. Though I should warn you, my consulting fees are quite steep. Your consulting fees? The pieces were clicking together in Julian's mind, forming a picture he didn't want to see. Hayes International. That's you. Among other things. Victoria sipped her champagne, utterly composed. Gerard, would you excuse us for a moment? I think Mr. Mercer and I have some unfinished business to address. Fontaine nodded, but not before placing a protective hand on Victoria's shoulder. Call me if you need anything, ma chérie. He walked away, leaving them in a bubble of privacy amid the crowded room. Julian's voice dropped to an urgent whisper. What's going on? Who are you? That's a complicated question. Victoria gestured toward a quiet alcove near the windows. They moved there together, away from curious ears. The city lights spread below them like scattered jewels. The truth unveiled. My full name, Victoria began, her tone conversational, is Victoria and Hayes Beaumont. The Beaumont part wasn't on our wedding invitation because I asked that it be removed. I wanted to see something, you understand. An experiment in human nature. Julian felt cold despite the warmth of the room. Beaumont. The name resonated with old money, European aristocracy, the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. My maternal grandfather was Alexander Beaumont. Perhaps you've heard of Beaumont Industries? They manufacture about 40% of the medical technology used in hospitals worldwide. My mother chose to live simply, married for love rather than status. She raised me to value character over wealth, integrity over appearance. But the publishing house job, the small apartment. All real, Victoria interrupted. I wanted to experience life without the Beaumont name opening doors. To understand what most people face every day. My trust fund sat untouched in European banks while I worked 40-hour weeks and paid my own rent. It was enlightening. Julian's mind reeled. Every assumption he had made, every cruel word at the wedding, had been based on a complete misunderstanding. Then why agree to marry me? If you're wealthy, if you have your own fortune. Because your father approached my family first, before coming to my parents. He didn't know who they were, you see. Just saw the Hayes name and made assumptions. My grandfather found it amusing. He called me and told me about the proposition. We discussed it, and I decided it might be interesting. A test, if you will. A test. Julian's voice was flat, hollow. I wanted to see if you were capable of basic human decency. If, when faced with marrying someone you believed was beneath you, you could still treat them with respect. Not love, not even affection. Just simple courtesy. Victoria's expression hardened. You failed spectacularly. The words hit him like punches. Julian remembered his speech at the cathedral, every contemptuous phrase, every calculated insult. He had been so proud of his rebellion, his refusal to be controlled. He had never considered that he was revealing exactly who he was at his core. After the wedding, I went home and made those phone calls, Victoria continued. I activated resources that had been dormant. Hayes International Consulting was created within a week, staffed by the best business minds my family could recruit. We didn't steal your clients, Julian. We simply offered them better service, better rates, and a level of integrity they weren't finding at Mercer Industries. This is revenge. The accusation came out weak, desperate. No. This is consequence. Victoria's voice remained calm, matter-of-fact. You humiliated me because you thought I was powerless. You assumed my poverty made me desperate, that my status made me disposable. You never asked about my education, my interests, my capabilities. You saw only what you wanted to see. Julian struggled to process everything. The clients were losing, the partnerships falling apart, that's all you? Not directly. But when people learn who I am, when they understand what happened at that wedding, they draw their own conclusions about the Mercer family's character. I haven't had to destroy you, Julian. You're destroying yourself. I'm simply providing an alternative for those who want to distance themselves from the wreckage. The document. Victoria opened the small evening clutch she carried and withdrew a folded envelope. She held it between them, a loaded gun in paper form. There's something else you should know. Something I discovered while preparing for our arranged marriage. I do thorough research on potential business partners, even unwilling ones. Julian stared at the envelope, afraid to touch it. Your father's company, the foundation of the Mercer fortune, was built on fraud. 30 years ago, Christopher Mercer embezzled funds from his business partner, a man named David Chen. He manipulated documents, created false records, and effectively stole half a company. David died 5 years later, broken and poor, convinced he had simply been a bad businessman. His family never knew the truth. That's impossible. My father built everything from nothing. He told me. He told you a story. A comfortable lie that let him sleep at night. Victoria's voice softened slightly, taking on an almost pitying quality. I have proof, Julian. Bank records, original documents, testimony from people who witnessed what happened. Everything needed to destroy not just your father's reputation, but his freedom. Fraud at that level carries serious prison time. Julian reached for the envelope with shaking hands. Inside were photocopies, but even copies were damning. He recognized his father's signature on documents dated 3 decades ago, transactions that transferred funds through a maze of accounts, contracts that had been altered after signing. Why are you showing me this? Why not just go to the authorities? Because despite everything, I'm not cruel. Victoria took the envelope back, tucking it safely away. Your father made a terrible mistake decades ago, and he's been running from it ever since. That fear, that guilt, drove him to control you, to try to force you into marriage as some kind of redemption. He thought if he could make you respectable, it would somehow erase his own sins. She met Julian's eyes directly, and he saw no anger there. Only a deep sadness and something that might have been disappointment. I'm giving you a choice. A real one, not the false choice your father gave you at that altar. You can continue as you are, watching your company collapse, blaming everyone but yourself. Or you can change. Actually change, not just pretend for appearances. What do you want from me? Nothing. I don't need anything from you. But there are people who do. David Chen's daughter works 3 jobs to support her family. His grandchildren can't afford college. They deserve justice, or at least compensation. Victoria's expression was steel wrapped in silk. Make it right, Julian. Use whatever resources you have left to help the family your father destroyed. Show that the Mercer name can mean something other than arrogance and cruelty. Julian felt something crack inside him, a shell of pride and entitlement that had protected him from ever seeing himself clearly. And if I do this? If I try to make amends? Then maybe you become someone worth knowing. Someone who actually deserves the privilege you were born with. Victoria's smile was small but genuine. I'm not your enemy, Julian. I never was. But I refuse to be your victim, and I won't stand by while your family destroys others the way Christopher destroyed David Chen. She turned to leave, then paused. The documents stay with me for now. Insurance, if you will. But prove you're capable of change, of genuine redemption, and perhaps they'll stay buried. The choice, as it always should have been, is yours. Victoria walked away, leaving Julian alone with the weight of revelations that had shattered his entire understanding of his life, his father, and himself. Through the windows, the city stretched endlessly, full of people with their own struggles and secrets. For the first time in his privileged existence, Julian Mercer felt small. Across the ballroom, Victoria rejoined Gerard Fontaine, slipping back into the role of successful businesswoman as easily as breathing. But Olivia Chen, who had been watching from a distance, saw the slight tremor in her friend's hands, the careful control it took to maintain composure. "Are you all right?" Olivia whispered. Victoria nodded slowly. "I will be." This needed to happen. He needed to know the truth. And now? Now we see if he's capable of becoming someone better. Or if he'll prove me right about everything I believed when I watched him destroy me at that altar. Victoria's voice carried no hope, only resignation. Either way, the truth is out. What he does with it will define who he really is. The gala continued around them, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. But for Julian Mercer, standing alone in the alcove with documents that proved his family's darkest secrets, everything had changed. The question that haunted him as he finally left the party was simple but devastating. Who was he without the lies he had been raised on? And did he have the courage to find out, the weight of truth? Julian Mercer sat in his father's study at 3 a.m, surrounded by 3 decades of carefully constructed lies. The room smelled of leather and old cigars, a sanctuary where Christopher had made the decisions that shaped their family's destiny. Now those decisions lay exposed under the harsh light of Julian's desk lamp, spread across mahogany like evidence at a crime scene. He had spent the past week diving into old records, cross-referencing the documents Victoria had shown him with files his father kept locked in a safe Julian had never been permitted to open. The combination had been easy to guess once he stopped believing in his father's infallibility. Christopher's wedding anniversary, a date that now felt like another layer of deception. Every document confirmed Victoria's claims. Bank statements showing mysterious transfers. Contracts with signatures that didn't quite match. Testimony from employees who had been paid generously to forget what they witnessed. David Chen's name appeared again and again, always followed by Christopher's careful erasure of his contributions, his ownership, his very existence from the company's history. Julian's phone buzzed. Robert Sterling's name appeared on the screen. He answered without greeting. "I found something," Robert's voice was tight with urgency. "About the Chen family. You need to see this. Send it." Minutes later, Julian stared at his computer screen, reading an article from a local newspaper dated 5 years ago. David Chen had died of a heart attack at 58, alone in a rented apartment barely larger than a storage unit. The article mentioned his daughter, Lin Chen, who worked as a nurse at Memorial Hospital. It mentioned grandchildren who had lost their college funds when David's business collapsed. It mentioned a man who had once been prominent and respected, reduced to nothing by what the article politely called unfortunate business circumstances. Julian's hands clenched into fists. His father had done this. Had stolen not just money but a man's entire life, his dignity, his future, and the futures of everyone who depended on him. And Julian had benefited from that theft every day of his privileged existence, never questioning where the money came from, never wondering whose suffering had funded his comfort. The study door opened. Christopher Mercer stood in the doorway, his bathrobe hanging loose on a frame that had grown thin over the past months. The stress of watching his empire crumble had aged him dramatically. His hair had gone completely white, his face drawn and haggard. "Julian? What are you doing up at this hour?" Julian didn't answer immediately. He simply gestured at the documents covering the desk, watching his father's face drain of color as recognition set in. "Where did you get those?" Christopher's voice was barely a whisper. "Does it matter?" Julian stood, his exhaustion replaced by cold clarity. Tell me it's not true. Tell me you didn't destroy David Chen and steal everything he built." Christopher moved into the room slowly, like a man approaching his own execution. He poured himself a drink with shaking hands, the crystal decanter rattling against the glass. "It was complicated. You don't understand the circumstances. Then explain them. Make me understand how stealing from your partner was justified." The silence stretched between them, heavy with 30 years of secrets. Finally, Christopher collapsed into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 68 years. "David and I started the company together. Equal partners, equal investment. But I was the one with vision, with drive. I worked 80-hour weeks while he went home to his family. I made the deals, built the relationships, took the risks. So you decided you deserved more. I decided I deserved what I had earned." Christopher's voice hardened with old resentment. When the company started succeeding, David wanted to coast. Wanted to enjoy the profits without putting in the work. I was building an empire, and he was satisfied with a comfortable living. Julian felt sick. "So you removed him. Systematically erased his contributions and took everything for yourself." "I paid him his initial investment back. With interest. After you had manipulated the books to show the company was worth a fraction of its actual value." Julian's anger was cold, controlled, more dangerous than any rage. "You made him think the business was failing, that his investment was worthless. Then you bought him out for pennies on the dollar and revealed the real profits after he was gone." Christopher said nothing, which was answer enough. "Did you ever think about him?" Julian asked quietly. "About what happened to him after you took everything? Did you know he died alone, broken, believing he was a failure? People make their own choices. David chose to give up. You gave him no choice." Julian's voice cracked like a whip. "And then you tried to control me the same way. Forcing me into marriage, manipulating my life because you were terrified someone would discover what you'd done. You weren't trying to teach me responsibility. You were trying to create a respectable image to hide behind." Christopher's silence was admission and defense combined. The Chen family. 2 days later, Julian stood outside Memorial Hospital, gathering courage he hadn't known he possessed. Inside, Lin Chen was finishing a double shift in the pediatric wing. He had learned everything about her over the past 48 hours. Single mother of 2 teenagers, working 60-hour weeks to keep her family afloat. Her father's death had left them with nothing but medical bills and broken dreams. The coffee shop across from the hospital was quiet at mid-morning. Julian chose a corner table and sent the message he had carefully composed. "Miss Chen, my name is Julian Mercer. I have information about your father that you deserve to know. Please meet me if you're willing. No obligations, no expectations. Just truth." He waited, stomach churning with anxiety and shame. 20 minutes passed. Then Lin Chen walked through the door. She was in her late 30s, with her father's eyes and a weariness that came from years of struggle. She wore scrubs decorated with cartoon characters, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She spotted Julian immediately, recognition flickering across her face. The Mercer name was infamous, especially after the wedding scandal. "I have 15 minutes before my next shift," she said, sitting across from him without preamble. "Make it count." Julian had rehearsed this conversation 100 times. Now every prepared word evaporated. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. "This contains documentation of what my father did to yours 30 years ago. Financial fraud, document manipulation, theft disguised as legitimate business. Everything that destroyed your father's company and took his future from him." Lynn's hands trembled as she opened the folder. Julian watched emotions play across her face: confusion, dawning comprehension, anger, and finally a devastating sadness. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she read, and Julian felt each one like a physical blow. I knew something was wrong, she whispered. Dad always said there was more to the story, that Christopher Mercer had somehow cheated him. But he had no proof, and eventually people stopped believing him. Even I started to think maybe he was just bitter about failing. He didn't fail. He was systematically destroyed by someone he trusted. Julian's voice was rough with emotion. And I benefited from that destruction my entire life. Everything I had, everything I was built on what was stolen from your family. Lynn looked up at him, her expression unreadable. Why are you telling me this? Why now? Because someone showed me who I really am. Who my family really is. Julian thought of Victoria standing in the ballroom, diamonds glittering at her throat, holding the power to destroy him and choosing instead to offer redemption. And because your family deserves justice, even if it comes 3 decades too late. He pulled out another document. This is a financial settlement offer. It represents the value your father's share of the company would be worth today, with compound interest. It's not enough. Nothing could be enough. But it's a start. Lynn stared at the number, her face going pale. It was enough to pay off her debts, send her children to college, secure her retirement. It was life-changing money. I don't understand. Your company is failing. Everyone knows the Mercers are bleeding money. Where would this come from? My personal accounts. Trust funds, investments, inheritances from my mother's side. Everything that's mine to give. Julian met her eyes directly. I'm also transferring ownership of certain properties and assets that rightfully should have been your father's. It won't bring him back. It won't erase the suffering he endured. But maybe it will give you and your children the future he wanted for you. Lynn's tears fell freely now, splashing onto the documents. Does your father know about this? No. And he'll fight it when he finds out. But these are my assets to distribute, and I'm choosing to do what should have been done 30 years ago. Julian's voice strengthened with conviction. Your father was wronged. Your family was wronged. I can't fix the past, but I can try to make the present more just. Confronting the past. The confrontation with Christopher came that evening, explosive and inevitable. Julian returned home to find his father waiting in the study, Robert Sterling standing awkwardly by the door. Christopher had discovered the financial transfers, the settlement offer, everything Julian had set in motion. You're destroying us, Christopher roared, his face flushed with rage. Giving away our fortune to chase some misguided sense of guilt over ancient history. That money is ours. You have no right. It was never ours. Julian's calm was absolute, unshakable. It was stolen. And I'm returning it to its rightful owners. David Chen is dead. His claim died with him. His family isn't dead. His daughter works herself to exhaustion. His grandchildren had to give up their dreams because you took everything from them. Julian stepped closer to his father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. You taught me that the Mercer name meant something. That we were better than others because we had built our success through hard work and integrity. Every word was a lie. Christopher's expression twisted with desperation. I built an empire. I gave you everything. You built a prison. For David Chen, for yourself, for me. Julian's voice dropped to something quiet and final. I'm selling my shares in Mercer Industries. Using the proceeds to fully compensate the Chen family and establish a foundation in David Chen's name. It will support families destroyed by corporate fraud, help whistleblowers, fund investigations into business corruption. You'll have nothing left. Christopher looked genuinely confused, as if Julian was speaking a foreign language. No company, no fortune, no future. You'll be ordinary. Julian thought of Victoria, who had chosen simplicity over using her family's name. Who had worked 40-hour weeks when she could have lived in luxury. Who had tested him and found him wanting, but still offered him a chance at redemption. Maybe ordinary is what I need to be. Maybe it's what I should have been all along. Robert stepped forward, his expression troubled but resolute. Julian, I want to help. With the foundation, with making this right. I've worked for your family for 15 years, and I never questioned where the money came from. I should have. We all should have. Christopher looked between them, seeing his world collapse in real time. You're both fools. Throwing away everything for sentiment, for some outdated notion of justice. The business world doesn't work that way. Everyone cuts corners, everyone makes hard choices. Everyone doesn't systematically destroy their partners and steal their livelihoods, Julian interrupted. And even if they did, that wouldn't make it right. It would just mean more people need to change. The final choice. The news broke 3 days later. Julian Mercer, once infamous for humiliating his bride at their wedding, was now making headlines for a different reason. The financial settlement with the Chen family, the foundation being established, the public acknowledgement of his father's fraud. The business world reacted with shock, skepticism, and grudging respect. Christopher Mercer faced federal investigation for decades-old fraud. The statute of limitations had passed on criminal charges, but civil suits were possible. More importantly, his reputation was destroyed beyond repair. The empire he had built on stolen foundations crumbled completely, faster now that the truth was exposed. Julian stood in his nearly empty apartment, most of his possessions sold or donated. He owned 3 suits, basic furniture, a laptop, and very little else. The opulence he had taken for granted his entire life was gone, stripped away by choice and consequence. He should have felt bereft. Instead, he felt lighter than he had in months. His phone rang. Victoria's name appeared on the screen. He answered, his heart pounding. I heard what you did, she said without preamble. The settlement, the foundation, everything. It was the right thing to do. The only thing, really. Julian moved to the window, watching the city below. I don't expect praise or forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I heard what you said. About becoming someone worth knowing. Lin Chen called me, Victoria said softly. She's a friend of Olivia's, though I didn't know that when I showed you the documents. She told me what you're doing, how you're giving up everything to make this right. It's not enough. It will never be enough. No. But it's a start. Victoria paused, and Julian could hear traffic in the background, the sounds of her world continuing. I'm not ready to forgive you for what you did at that wedding. The humiliation, the cruelty, it's not something that disappears just because you make amends to someone else. I know. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But, Victoria continued, her voice warming slightly, I believe people can change if they're willing to do the hard work. If they're willing to face who they've been and choose to become someone better. You're doing that work, Julian. Actually doing it, not just performing it for appearances. Julian felt something unfold in his chest, fragile as new wings. Not hope exactly, but possibility. What happens now? Now you continue. You build this foundation, you help the Chen family, you figure out who Julian Mercer is when he's not hiding behind money and privilege. And maybe, eventually, when enough time has passed and enough has changed, we have coffee. Just coffee, between 2 people who have both learned hard lessons about character and consequence. I'd like that. Someday. Someday, Victoria agreed. But Julian? Don't do this for me. Don't change because you think it will win me back or erase what happened. Do it because it's right. Because you want to be someone who adds value to the world instead of taking from it. I will. I am. He meant it with every fiber of his being. They ended the call with no promises, no declarations, just a tentative understanding that redemption was possible but never guaranteed. Julian stood at his window as evening fell over the city, watching lights flicker on in thousands of windows. Behind each one was a life, a story, struggles and dreams he had never considered when he was the arrogant heir to a stolen fortune. His phone buzzed with a message from Lin Chen. "The kids got their college acceptance letters today. Thank you for giving them back their future." Julian smiled, genuine and unforced. He had spent his entire life taking, consuming, demanding. Now he was learning to give, to build, to create something that mattered beyond his own comfort. The man who had stood at that altar 6 months ago, mocking a woman he thought was beneath him, was gone. In his place was someone still figuring out who he was, but at least now he was building that identity on truth instead of lies. Across the city, Victoria stood on her balcony, Olivia beside her with 2 glasses of wine. The night was clear, stars visible despite the urban glow. "Do you think he'll actually change?" Olivia asked. "Or is this just another performance?" Victoria considered the question carefully. "I think he's trying. Really trying. Whether he succeeds or not remains to be seen. But at least now he knows the cost of cruelty, the weight of privilege, the responsibility that comes with power. And if he does change? If he becomes someone genuine? Then maybe the story doesn't end with humiliation and revenge. Maybe it ends with 2 people who learned hard lessons and came out better for it." Victoria smiled into the darkness. "Or maybe it just ends with both of us moving forward as better versions of ourselves, whether together or apart. Either way, the truth is out. The lies are exposed. And that's worth something, even if it's not a fairy tale ending." The city hummed below them, full of stories and second chances, of falls from grace and hard-won redemptions. Julian Mercer's transformation was just one among millions, but it was his to own, his to complete or fail. The choice, as Victoria had told him, was his. And for the first time in his life, Julian was making that choice with open eyes and a clear conscience, building something real on the ruins of everything he had been taught to value. The road ahead was uncertain, stripped of guarantees and safety nets. But it was his road, walked honestly, and that made all the difference. The end.